Picture Rome in the year 1032. The most powerful religious institution on earth needs a leader. Someone to guide 2 billion souls. Someone to speak for God himself. Someone to make decisions that will echo through centuries. They chose a 12-year-old. Not because he was the most spiritual. Not because he was chosen by God. Not because he'd earned it or proven himself worthy. He was chosen because his father had money and his family had power, and in medieval Rome, that's all that mattered. His name was Benedict IX, and his papacy was so catastrophically insane that it became the lowest point in 2,000 years of church history. But he wasn't the only one. The church kept doing this. Over and over, putting teenagers on the throne of St. Peter, handing absolute power to boys who hadn't even finished puberty, watching them destroy the institution from the inside, and then doing it all over again with the next family's son. This is the story of the youngest popes in history. Boys and teenagers given supreme spiritual authority over hundreds of millions of people. What they did with that power, who they hurt, and why the church kept making the same catastrophic mistake, again and again, until the entire institution nearly collapsed. This is institutional chaos. This is the papacy at its absolute darkest. Before we dive into the chaos, I need you to answer this in the comments. At what age do you think someone should be able to wield absolute power? And honestly, how young is too young? Because the popes we're about to talk about were younger than your little siblings. Also, drop your location and tell me which pope's story in this video makes you the most angry. And I want to know which one broke you first. Part 1. The child pope who ruled 3 times. His name was Benedict IX, and he was approximately 12 years old when the Catholic Church handed him control of 2 billion souls. This isn't exaggeration. This isn't speculation. Medieval chroniclers, men who actually lived through his reign, documented that Benedict was a child. Born into the Tusculan family, one of Rome's most powerful aristocratic clans, Benedict was elected pope as an inheritance. His father and uncles didn't see the papacy as a spiritual office. They saw it as a piece of family real estate, and Benedict was the heir they'd chosen. When a child takes absolute power, what happens? Chaos. Unfiltered, catastrophic, institutional chaos. Contemporary accounts describe Pope Benedict IX, and remember, he's still a teenager at this point, as violent, corrupt, openly immoral. And I'm not talking about medieval exaggeration. I'm talking about accusations so extreme, so graphic, that even the chroniclers of that era, men who'd seen warlords, crusades and public torture, were scandalized enough to write it down. One chronicler said Benedict turned the papal palace into a den of vice. Another said he was a monster who used his office to satisfy his own depravities. The accusations were so widespread and so consistent that even if half of them were exaggerated, the baseline truth is clear. A child with absolute power became absolutely corrupt. But here's where it gets actually insane. Benedict didn't just rule once. He ruled 3 separate times. He was deposed. He came back. He was driven out again. He returned a 3rd time. Like a nightmare that keeps restarting. Like the church couldn't figure out how to get rid of him because he kept crawling back into power. At one point in 1045, his godfather, yes, his godfather, literally paid him money to resign, not to reform, not to step down with dignity, to sell the papacy. Benedict took the cash and walked away. He became the only pope in history to resign because someone paid him to. Then he changed his mind. He tried to get the job back. He actually returned to Rome with forces to reclaim the papacy that he'd just sold. Now there were 2 popes claiming legitimacy, and the church was fracturing. It took the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Emperor Henry III, to ride into Rome, depose both of them, and install his own candidate just to stop the bleeding. Finally, after years of chaos, after destroying the credibility of the entire institution, Benedict IX actually retired to a monastery. He spent the rest of his life doing penance. But the damage was done. The church had been shattered by a child with absolute power, and everyone knew it. Historians call Benedict IX's papacy the lowest point in 2,000 years of church history, not the second lowest, the lowest. A child had been given absolute authority and had used it to nearly destroy the institution itself. But the church didn't learn. They just did it again. Part 2. The teenage pope who lost everything. 23 years after Benedict IX was finally removed, the church elected another young pope. This time, he was 18. His name was John XII. Born Octavian, he came from the same Tusculan family that had already caused Rome endless trouble with Benedict IX. And again, his election wasn't spiritual. It was political. It was dynastic. His father basically appointed him, and the cardinals rubber-stamped it. John XII was young. He was untested. He had no spiritual formation. He'd never held any position of authority. And he was about to run the church. What happened next was a masterclass in how absolute power corrupts absolutely, especially when you give it to someone whose brain is still developing. John XII didn't pray. He hunted. He feasted while the church preached poverty. He gambled. He drank. According to contemporary chroniclers, and again, these aren't wild accusations, these are documented accounts, the Lateran Palace, which is supposed to be the seat of Christ on earth, became a casino, a tavern, a place of scandal. The moral authority of the papacy, which had already been shattered by Benedict IX, was now being actively destroyed by John XII, one reckless decision at a time, but it got worse. Politically, John was a disaster. He made enemies constantly. He'd ally with one noble, then betray him. He'd promise loyalty to the emperor, then turn against him. He was playing a game he didn't understand, against players who'd been strategizing for decades, and he was losing badly. When his position weakened, John panicked. He crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor, hoping that imperial power would protect him. It worked, for a while. Otto had the military strength to keep John in power. But then John turned against Otto anyway. He panicked again. He thought Otto was a threat, so he betrayed the one man who was actually protecting him. Otto didn't take it well. Otto returned to Rome with an army. A synod was called, and Pope John XII was deposed, simply removed from office. The teenage pope who'd been handed absolute authority had lost everything because he didn't know how to use it. He was briefly reinstated, then deposed again. His credibility was destroyed. His authority was a joke. And at the age of 27, John XII died. Suddenly, mysteriously, with rumours of poisoning circulating because that's what happened when a young pope became too unstable for the nobles around him. John XII proved something crucial. Youth alone isn't the problem. It's youth paired with absolute power and zero restraint. A teenager's brain isn't equipped to handle global consequences. A teenager's judgment isn't mature enough to navigate centuries-old political alliances. And when you give a teenager supreme authority with no one to answer to, you don't get a spiritual leader, you get a catastrophe. But the church still didn't learn. They kept doing it. Part 3. 30 years later, the church elected another young pope. This time something different happened. Benedict VIII was elected at around 20 or 22 years old. He came from the same Tusculan family that had already destroyed the papacy twice. On paper, this looked like a disaster in the making. Another young aristocrat. Another family inheritance. Another setup for chaos. But Benedict VIII was different. Unlike John XII, Benedict didn't squander his power. Unlike Benedict IX, he didn't descend into depravity. Instead, Benedict VIII took one look at the ruins of his family's previous papacies and decided to actually be competent. He was ruthless. He cracked down on his enemies. He stabilized Rome. He worked closely with the Holy Roman Emperor to restore order. He wasn't a saint. He was a political operator. But he was a political operator who understood that the church had been damaged by incompetence, and he was going to fix it. Militarily, Benedict VIII even personally led troops into battle. Remember, at this point, the Pope isn't just a spiritual leader. He's a ruler, a king, someone who commands armies and controls territory. And Benedict VIII, at barely 22, was willing to strap on armour and fight for his position. The crazy part, it worked. Benedict VIII's papacy was actually effective. The church stabilised under his watch. Rome stopped tearing itself apart. The institution survived his reign stronger than it had been in decades. Benedict VIII proves something critical. Youth isn't the problem. Power without restraint is the problem. When you pair youth with competence, with discipline, with an understanding of the gravity of the situation, something actually works. Benedict VIII didn't fail because he was young. He succeeded because he was aware of what his predecessors had destroyed, and he refused to repeat their mistakes. But he was the exception, not the rule. Part 4. The foreign pope surrounded by enemies. In 996, the church elected another young pope at an even younger age. Gregory V was just 24. But Gregory V's youth wasn't his biggest problem. His origin was. Gregory V was German. He was the first German pope in history. And he was placed on the throne by his cousin, Emperor Otto III, using imperial power rather than democratic church process. From the moment he became pope, Romans saw him as an outsider, a foreigner, an imperial puppet imposed on the city. Gregory tried to rule seriously. He attempted reforms. He genuinely tried to be a good pope. But his authority was completely dependent on Otto's protection. The moment Otto left Rome, local factions that resented this young German outsider struck back. Gregory was driven out of the city. An anti-pope was installed to replace him. Gregory was forced into exile, humiliated, completely displaced. When Otto returned with an army, Gregory was restored to power. But the damage was irreversible. His short reign was marked by constant instability, constant threats, constant exile. He never had the political footing to actually grow into the office. At 27 years old, Gregory V died suddenly. Officially, illness. Unofficially, rumours of poisoning circulated, because when a young pope dies too conveniently, people talk. Gregory V reveals another danger of youthful popes: dependence. At 24, he wasn't weak or reckless or immoral. He was just too young to navigate the political machinery surrounding him. He was surrounded by people far more experienced, far more ruthless, and far more willing to use him as a tool. His age didn't make him corrupt. It made him vulnerable. Part 5. The Pope who was never allowed to rule. In 931, the Church elected John XI at around 25 years old. But John XI's story is different from all the others. John XI wasn't a disaster. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't incompetent. He was something worse, completely powerless. John XI was the son, or at least the widely believed son, of Marozia, the most powerful woman in Rome. Marozia ruled the city through family connections, political alliances, and brute force. She was the shadow ruler of Rome, and she placed her son on the papal throne not to lead the church, but to legitimize her own control. From day one, John XI was a puppet. Real decisions were made by his mother. Real power was wielded by her allies. John was present but politically sidelined. He was a symbol, a figurehead, a tool. It got worse. Marozia's son from another marriage, John's half-brother, eventually seized even more power. He didn't like sharing, so he imprisoned Pope John XI. He locked his own brother, the Pope, away. John XI spent the rest of his pontificate as a prisoner, not as a deposed pope, not as a removed leader, as an actual captive held by his own family. He died in captivity, his papacy reduced to a tragic symbol of powerlessness. John XI's story reveals the quietest danger of youthful popes. Sometimes they weren't given the chance to fail because they were never allowed to rule at all. He wasn't deposed for scandal. He wasn't overthrown for heresy. He was simply too young, too controlled, and too disposable to matter. He was pope in name only, a prisoner in the palace, a victim of his own family's ambition. Part 6. The Pope who wasn't even a priest. And then there's Leo VIII. His story might be the strangest of all. In 963, Emperor Otto I decided Rome needed a new pope. He didn't like the current one, Pope John XII, the reckless teenager we talked about earlier. So Otto held a synod, a council, and had John XII deposed. removed from power. Then Otto needed to install a replacement, someone loyal, someone controllable, someone young. He chose a man named Leo VIII, who was probably in his early to mid-20s, who was definitely a layman, who had never been ordained as a priest. Now canon law, the laws of the Church, explicitly states that a pope has to be ordained, has to be a priest. It's non-negotiable. You can't be pope if you're not a priest. Leo VIII wasn't a priest, so Otto did something unprecedented. He rushed Leo through every single clerical rank in a single day, layman to deacon to priest to bishop to pope, in one day, to bypass canon law because the emperor needed a pope and Leo was his guy. The Church erupted. Many Romans didn't recognize Leo as a legitimate pope. To them, he was an imperial placeholder, someone who'd been installed illegally, ordained illegally, made pope illegally. When Otto left Rome, the city revolted. John XII, the deposed pope, returned and reclaimed his throne. Leo fled. The papacy descended into complete chaos, with two men claiming to be pope and the city split between them. Only after John XII's sudden death did Leo regain control, but even then his authority was fragile, contested, constantly questioned. He'd been installed, not elected, rushed, not prepared, and his illegitimacy haunted his entire reign. Leo VIII's youth wasn't his greatest problem. His problem was that he was installed by imperial decree without proper ordination, without proper authority, without the Church's actual consent. He was a placeholder wearing borrowed vestments, and everyone knew it. So there you have it. 6 young popes. Some were reckless monsters, some were powerless prisoners, some were competent operators, some were illegally ordained replacements installed by emperors. What they all had in common was this. The Church kept handing absolute power to people whose brains were still developing, whose judgment was unproven, whose experience was zero. Why did they keep doing this? Because power is hereditary in Rome. Because aristocratic families treated the papacy like property. Because emperors wanted young, controllable popes they could manipulate. Because nobody had the institutional will to stop putting teenagers on the throne of St. Peter. The cost was catastrophic. The credibility of the papacy was shattered. The Church was fractured. Institutions collapsed. Chaos ensued. All because the most powerful religious organisation in the world kept electing children to positions that required centuries of wisdom and experience. And the craziest part, this still isn't the worst of papal history. There are popes who murdered their rivals, popes who fathered children while claiming celibacy, popes who started wars for personal vengeance, popes who were literally accused of being the Antichrist, popes who orchestrated betrayals that echo through history. The youngest popes were chaos, but the next videos go straight into the darkness, the scandals, the murders, the institutional corruption that makes the teenage pope stories look like nursery rhymes. If you thought giving a 12-year-old absolute power was insane, wait until you see what popes did when they actually had experience and time to plan their atrocities. Subscribe now, because the papacy hasn't shown you anything yet.